Opening murder in the glass conservatory. The sharp crack of breaking glass split the air. Lady Margaret froze, her eyes wide, the glass of orange juice slipping from her hand. It shattered across the sunlit floor, shards glittering like blades under the noonday light. A single white flower toppled from its vase and fell beside her limp hand. The conservatory doors were locked. No one had left, which meant the killer was still here, seated among them all, in broad daylight. Miss Marple set her teacup down gently. Her gaze swept the table, calm yet piercing. In a room flooded with light, she knew darkness was hiding somewhere. Chaos erupted. A scream cut through the warm air. Chairs toppled. Footsteps clattered against the tiled floor. Clara pressed her hands to her face, sobbing uncontrollably. Sir Julian leapt to his feet, pacing, his eyes darting nervously as though searching for escape. Dr. Lionel Green bent over the fallen hostess, his hands trembling as he checked for a pulse. "She's gone," he whispered, but his voice shook, betraying something more than grief. The scent of citrus lingered in the air, mingled now with a faint, acrid note that prickled the senses. Sunlight streamed through the glass panels overhead, too bright, too merciless. It illuminated Lady Margaret's body sprawled on the floor, her lifeless eyes staring upward, reflecting the fractured patterns of the glass above. The entire scene looked staged, as if the room itself had become a cruel theater. And in that moment, with every guest still present, every eye turned toward the body, one fact became chillingly clear. Someone among them had committed murder in plain sight. Miss Marple, quiet in her corner, did not cry out, did not flinch. Instead, she leaned back slightly, her expression unreadable. She noticed the shattered glass, the oddly displaced flower, the way the light caught on the conservatory windows as though freezing a shadow in motion. While panic gripped the others, she was already sifting through the noise, the fear, and the lies. This was no accident. It was a performance, and the truth, however carefully hidden, had already begun to reveal itself. Chapter 1. The Guests in the Sunlight. The commotion in the conservatory slowly ebbed into a tense hush. The warm fragrance of roses and orchids still hung in the air, clashing uneasily with the acrid tang of spilled orange juice. Lady Margaret's body remained motionless, her lifeless hands stretched across the polished tiles, her overturned glass glittering like a cruel reminder of what had just unfolded. Miss Marple did not rush to the body as others did. She sat quietly in her place, folding her hands neatly in her lap, her sharp eyes taking in everything, the fragments of glass, the flower that had fallen at just the right moment, the shifting expressions of those still alive. In her long life, she had learned that first reactions were often the truest. People had not yet gathered their masks, and in those unguarded seconds, truth slipped out like smoke through a crack. Sir Julian Ashcroft. It was Sir Julian, Lady Margaret's younger brother, who broke the silence first. "This is madness," he barked, his voice far too loud, as if volume alone could smother his fear. He paced, tugging at the hem of his waistcoat, his movements restless, erratic. His eyes darted from the body to the conservatory doors, as though measuring how far escape might be. Julian's reputation had long been tarnished by whispered gossip, gambling debts, questionable business ventures, unpaid loans. Miss Marple recalled overhearing villagers mention his creditors, men who had waited too long for money that never came. The death of his wealthy sister would, undoubtedly, shift the family's fortunes. The thought did not escape her. Clara Whitmore Clara, the adopted niece, was a contrast altogether. She sat collapsed in her chair, slender shoulders trembling, her hands covering her tear-streaked face. Her voice cracked between sobs. She was like a mother to me." Sympathy fluttered around the table, but Miss Marple's gaze lingered. Clara was young, intelligent, though often underestimated. And yet, when the mention of the poisoned drink passed someone's lips, Miss Marple saw Clara's head twitch, her watery eyes darting quickly toward Dr. Green, then back again. It was a fleeting glance, but one that told of a connection, fear, recognition, or guilt that had not been spoken aloud. Dr. Lionel Green, Dr. Green knelt by Lady Margaret, performing the motions of a physician, though he already knew the outcome. His silver hair glistened in the sunlight, and his spectacles slipped down the bridge of his nose. He pulled a handkerchief from his pocket, wiping his trembling fingers. As he did, Miss Marple's keen eyes noticed something faint but telling. A fresh scratch on his knuckle, raw and red, as though he had brushed against something sharp. He muttered solemnly, "She's gone. It must have been sudden, perhaps her heart." But even as he spoke, the doctor's words wavered. For a man of science, his explanation was thin, almost rehearsed. Victor Hensley. At the far side of the table, Victor Hensley, the family's lawyer, remained nearly still. His posture was impeccable, his gray suit pressed and spotless, his thin lips pressed into a line of forced composure. He had not moved toward the body, nor spoken to comfort the others. Instead, his eyes, sharp, calculating, were fixed on the leather briefcase resting by his chair. Miss Marple had seen men like him before, men whose true allegiance was not to truth or family, but to papers and signatures that bound fortunes together. What document might sit within that briefcase? What secrets? She tucked away the observation for later. Emily Carter. Emily Carter, the housekeeper of decades, hovered in the background. Her hands twisted the edge of her apron as she whispered almost to herself, "I don't understand. I had just changed the flowers. I only stepped away for a moment." Her face was pale, her voice unsteady. To some, it might have seemed the grief of a loyal servant. But to Miss Marple, there was something peculiar in the way Emily repeated her words, as if rehearsing an alibi for anyone who might question her. The conservatory in sunlight. All around them, the conservatory stood silent witness. The glass walls captured every ray of sun, flooding the room with brilliance so intense it almost mocked the darkness of the act that had taken place within. The orchids drooped gracefully, unaware of the tragedy, their petals glowing with translucent beauty. Vines curled across trellises, casting patterns of shadow across the floor. Miss Marple noted every detail: the displaced flower on the tiles, the faint crack across one of the overhead panes, the way the light seemed to refract strangely across a tall glass of untouched champagne. Nothing here, she thought, was accidental. The inspector arrives. At last, the heavy doors creaked open and Inspector Harold Bentley strode in with 2 constables behind him. His round face was flushed from the heat, his mustache bristling with irritation. "What's this then, at this?" he demanded, surveying the frozen guests and the lifeless body. "A sudden collapse? Natural causes, surely." A murmur of protest rippled through the group. Clara sobbed louder. Julian barked something about poisons. The inspector raised his hand for silence. "No one leaves this room until I've taken your statements," he announced firmly. Miss Marple sipped her tea, remarkably calm in the storm. She had heard the inspector dismiss such cases before, preferring the simplest answer. But she, unlike him, did not believe in coincidences. Lady Margaret had not simply collapsed. Her eyes swept the guests once more. Already, the cracks in their stories were beginning to show. And Miss Marple knew with certainty, in the dazzling sunlight of the glass conservatory, a murder had been committed with precision and cunning. And whoever had orchestrated it was sitting calmly among them, believing themselves still hidden. Chapter 2. The conservatory clues and the sound of breaking glass. The conservatory had fallen into an uneasy quiet. The scent of citrus still hung in the warm air, mingling with the perfume of orchids and the faint metallic tang that seemed to seep from the shattered glass on the floor. Lady Margaret's body had been moved to a quieter corner by order of Inspector Bentley, though Miss Marple doubted such gestures of propriety could mask the fact that they were standing in the very theater of murder. The inspector barked instructions to the constables, his voice brisk but distracted. He preferred to see what had happened as an accident, a fainting spell, a heart too weak for the heat. Miss Marple, however, leaned on her cane and looked not at the body but at the room itself. The scene, the objects, the details that could not lie. Sunlight streamed in through the vast panes overhead, every glint and shadow magnified. And it was here, in the play of light and sound, that Miss Marple began to sense the careful hand of design. The first detail, the glass. She bent toward the shattered orange juice glass. It lay in fragments across the tiled floor, the liquid spreading outward in a thin pool. Miss Marple's fingers, though delicate, hovered just above the shards, careful not to touch. The rim of one fragment glittered oddly. She noticed a faint, oily sheen on the surface, catching the light differently than the rest. Poison, perhaps, applied in haste or with cunning. She made no comment, only straightened slowly, her eyes scanning the faces of the guests. Julian had gone pale, his lips pressed thin. Clara avoided the sight altogether. The doctor coughed into his handkerchief. Each reaction was a small performance, but Miss Marple knew better than to take performances at face value. The second detail, the white flower on the tiles beside the glass lay the white flower. At first glance it looked harmless, a blossom fallen from the vase above, but Miss Marple noticed its petals were unblemished, its stem whole. It had not fallen naturally. Someone had placed or dropped it with intention. The inspector dismissed it. A flower, nothing more. But to Miss Marple it was a symbol. It had drawn eyes, just as it had drawn hers, a perfect distraction. The flower had fallen at the very moment of the cracking sound that startled the party. A coincidence? Hardly. The third detail, the sound. She turned her eyes upward to the ceiling of glass high above their heads. One pane bore a hairline fracture, fine but visible, like a vein of silver running through clear ice. "It was that sound," Clara whispered suddenly. "The crack just before she fell." "Yes," Sir Julian added gruffly, eager to confirm. "I heard it too, like a whip." Miss Marple said nothing, but she thought the pane had not cracked at that precise moment. It bore the look of a fracture formed earlier, perhaps even deliberately weakened. But the sound that echoed at the exact instant of Lady Margaret's collapse, it had been staged. Someone had used it to divert attention, to mask the switching of a glass or the slipping of something into her drink. The breaking sound, the flower, the sunlight. A performance. The guests under scrutiny. Inspector Bentley gathered them near the long table once more, demanding order. He began to take statements, his notebook open, his mustache twitching as he wrote. Miss Marple listened closely, for in their words lay as much evidence as in the objects around them. Julian's statement. "I stepped out briefly," Julian insisted, "for a breath of air. The conservatory was stifling, unbearable. When I returned, Margaret had already lifted her glass." "Did anyone see you outside?" Bentley asked. Julian faltered. "No, but I assure you I was not near her." Miss Marple noted the sweat on his temple, though the room was not so warm, and she recalled the faint cough someone had mentioned earlier, heard not outside but within. His lie was clumsy, and lies always left residue. Clara's statement. Clara's voice shook. I never left my seat. I was speaking with Lady Margaret just before it happened. She was telling me about the orchids. She seemed so well, and then..." Tears blurred her words. But Miss Marple remembered. Clara's glass bore a faint trace of lipstick, though Clara claimed not to have touched it since the start of the tea. Had someone placed it differently? Or had Clara been less honest about her movements? Dr. Green's statement. The doctor adjusted his spectacles. "I sat opposite Lady Margaret. I assure you she seemed perfectly well. Perhaps the heat, or an underlying condition. I saw nothing unusual. Yet Miss Marple recalled his trembling hands, the scratch on his knuckle, and the way his gaze lingered on the fallen glass. He was too quick to offer medical explanations, too eager to seal the case with natural causes." Hensley's statement. The lawyer's words were precise. "I was reviewing documents in my case while sipping tea. I barely noticed the conversation. When the glass fell, I looked up. That is all I can say." Too precise, Miss Marple thought, too rehearsed, and his eyes never strayed far from his briefcase, as though it contained something more pressing than death itself. Emily's statement. The housekeeper twisted her apron. I was at the sideboard fetching more sugar. I only turned away for a moment. Then I heard it, the sound, like the glass above had cracked. And when I looked, it was too late. She repeated herself almost word for word when asked again. Miss Marple knew. Repetition was often the shield of a lie. Miss Marple's observations. As each spoke, Miss Marple formed a quiet map in her mind. The false sound of glass breaking. The flower dropped as a distraction. The switching or poisoning of the glass in that instant. Each statement laced with contradiction. She leaned back, her knitting needles unused in her bag. A conservatory, drenched in sunlight, had become a stage. Every movement, every sound had been choreographed. She would not be surprised if even the flower had been touched by the hand of murder. A sudden interruption. Just as Bentley prepared to close his notebook with a grumble of, likely a fainting spell, a constable rushed in. He carried a sliver of glass wrapped carefully in cloth. "Sir," he said, "we found this shard apart from the rest, near the far corner. It seems to have been struck, not simply shattered. And there's a trace of blood." The room froze. All eyes turned toward Dr. Green, who instinctively pulled his handkerchief tighter over his hand. The scratch on his knuckle, red and raw, seemed suddenly very visible. But Miss Marple did not speak. Not yet. She knew better than to leap. Evidence pointed one way now, but murder was rarely so simple. The truth lay buried beneath layers of deception, each crafted to mislead. The weight of sunlight. As the inspector blustered and questioned, Miss Marple's gaze lifted once more to the ceiling of glass. Sunlight poured down, merciless in its clarity. The conservatory had been designed to nurture life, to flood plants with brilliance. Yet today it had revealed death in its harshest form. She thought to herself, in a room where every shadow is banished, deceit must learn to use the light itself as a weapon. And she knew, with a certainty sharpened by years of watching human nature, that what had happened here was not a matter of chance. It was a murder staged like a magician's trick. Noise, distraction, reflection, memory itself twisted to serve the hand of the killer. The sound of breaking glass, the fall of a single flower, the gleam of a poisoned drink, these were not coincidences. They were moves in a carefully played game, and the game had only just begun. Chapter 3: Secrets Beneath the Sunlit Glass. The conservatory, once a place of beauty, had become a chamber of unease. The orchids and roses, drenched in noon light, looked like silent witnesses to something wicked. The guests had been separated into smaller groups as Inspector Bentley tried to impose order, yet tension lingered like a storm held just above their heads. Miss Marple sat quietly, her presence almost overlooked. That suited her well. It allowed her to observe, to listen, to stitch together what others would dismiss as scraps of gossip or nervous ramblings. She knew that in every family tragedy, secrets lay beneath the polished surface, waiting for cracks to bring them into the light. Sir Julian Ashcroft. The desperate brother. Sir Julian stood near the tall French doors, tugging at his collar. He had claimed earlier that he stepped out for air, but Miss Marple had not missed the sweat on his brow when no one else seemed overheated. Whispers about Julian had drifted even as far as St. Mary Mead. He was a man of appetite. Gambling halls in London, creditors who waited with crossed arms, estates sold off discreetly. Now, with his sister gone, what remained of the Ashcroft fortune might pass to him, unless her will told another story. Miss Marple noticed the way he kept glancing toward the briefcase at Victor Hensley's feet. His eyes flickered with greed, but also with fear. Perhaps he longed to see confirmation that Lady Margaret had secured his rescue, or perhaps he dreaded the opposite, that she had planned to cut him out entirely. Clara Whitmore, the adopted heir. Clara, seated with her hands clasped tightly, looked like grief incarnate. Her shoulders shook with quiet sobs, and her youth made her sorrow appear all the more tragic. Yet Miss Marple had spent a lifetime learning that innocence was often a mask, and masks could be worn with alarming ease. Clara had been taken in by Lady Margaret after her parents' death in an accident. She had been raised as family, educated, clothed, given a home among wealth she could never have expected otherwise. But gratitude did not erase ambition. If whispers were true, Margaret had considered making Clara her heir, perhaps even over her own brother. Miss Marple's sharp eyes noticed something else: the way Clara had reacted when the glass broke. She had jerked violently, yes, but her eyes had darted first toward Dr. Green before settling on Lady Margaret. That moment of instinct was telling. Did she fear the doctor's involvement? Or was she silently acknowledging a shared secret? Dr. Lionel Green, the family physician. The doctor had been the first to kneel at Lady Margaret's side, his professional instinct disguising his personal alarm. He muttered about heart failure, heat stroke, explanations that felt rushed, too simple. Miss Marple recalled hearing, in hushed tones at the village shop, that Dr. Green had invested unwisely in a friend's business venture. Money had been lost, debts accrued, and though he maintained an air of respectability, he was not free from financial desperation. Lady Margaret, a patron of local causes, might have known. She might even have refused him help. And then there was the scratch on his hand, raw and oddly placed. A man of medicine ought to notice such details, to tend to them, yet he had concealed it poorly, as though embarrassed. Miss Marple did not yet conclude guilt. But she did see a man whose veneer of control was cracking, Victor Hensley, the lawyer with secrets. Victor Hensley remained composed, perhaps too composed. His spectacles glinted as he took meticulous notes for the inspector, his lips pressed into a thin line. Every so often, his hand brushed the leather briefcase, not protectively, but possessively, like a gambler clutching his last chip. The legal man's role was always precarious. He held the keys to inheritance, to documents that could make or ruin reputations. Miss Marple suspected he knew more than he would admit. Did he conceal changes to Lady Margaret's will? Did he fear exposure of his own dealings? She noted his silence during the doctor's testimony, the subtle flick of his gaze toward Julian, and how quickly he shifted his weight when Clara spoke of the orchids. Each gesture hinted at deeper knowledge, perhaps complicity. Emily Carter, the housekeeper's burden. Emily Carter, long-serving housekeeper, moved in and out of the room, her apron stained from nervously twisting it in her hands. She repeated the same words. I had only stepped away for flowers, with the precision of someone rehearsing a part. Miss Marple knew the type. Loyal, yes, but also bound by secrets. Years of service made Emily privy to quarrels, whispers, private letters left carelessly upon desks. She may not have sought wealth, but perhaps she had stumbled upon truths dangerous enough to keep her awake at night. The housekeeper's eyes lingered on Clara too often, not with affection, but with unease. It was a look Miss Marple recognized, the look of someone who knows more than they dare confess. Patterns in the sunlight. Miss Marple leaned back, knitting untouched in her lap. Her eyes roamed the conservatory once more, the glint of light across the broken pane above, the reflection of orchids in the tiles, the flower lying precisely where it would catch attention. Murder, she knew, was rarely random. It was born of desperation, anger, or greed, and it always left patterns. She saw those patterns forming now, threads weaving between Julian's debts, Clara's inheritance, Green's financial ruin, Hensley's secrets, Emily's silences. She thought quietly, the truth of a family is never found in what they boast, but in what they hide. An interruption. Just as the inspector prepared to dismiss the gathering with promises of further questioning, a constable returned with an envelope. Found in Lady Margaret's desk, sir. Marked urgent. Bentley grunted, tore it open. His brows furrowed as he read. Blast it. It's half finished. Something about... He paused, glancing uneasily at the guests. Something about a meeting in the conservatory. Tonight, to discuss... betrayal. The word hung in the air like a thunderclap. Miss Marple's eyes flickered to the flower once more, to the fractured pane above. A meeting arranged, a betrayal hinted at, a glass switched in plain sight. The secrets beneath the sunlight were no longer whispers. They were rising, demanding to be heard. Chapter 4. Testimonies and contradictions. The conservatory had grown oppressively quiet. though the noon light still poured through the glass walls as if mocking the shadows creeping into the hearts of those gathered. Inspector Bentley stood squarely in the center of the tiled floor, his notebook open, mustache bristling with irritation. He preferred straightforward answers, but even he could sense the unease curling through the air. Around him, the guests waited, restless and pale. Each seemed eager to speak, yet terrified of what their own words might betray. And in the corner, her knitting resting idly in her lap, Miss Marple watched with the patience of one who knew human nature better than most. She understood that lies never lined up neatly. They frayed, they tangled, they tripped the liar sooner or later. The first statement. Sir Julian Ashcroft. Right then, Bentley said gruffly. Sir Julian, you first. State plainly what you saw. Julian cleared his throat, pulling himself taller, though his fingers drummed nervously against his trousers. I stepped out, Inspector, as I mentioned before. The air in here was unbearable. When I returned, Lady Margaret had already raised her glass. The next thing I knew... He gestured toward the corner where her body now lay covered. She collapsed. I saw nothing more. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. A small detail had shifted. Earlier, Julian had said he returned before Margaret raised her glass. Now he claimed he returned as she was already lifting it. A subtle change, perhaps overlooked by Bentley, but not by her. She noted it silently. Lies often grew legs, stumbling clumsily from one version to the next. Anyone confirm you stepped out? Bentley pressed. Julian hesitated too long. No, I was alone. That pause, Miss Marple thought, was worth more than the words themselves. It was the silence of a man trying to construct a story while the walls closed in as at the second statement. Clara Whitmore. Next came Clara, her eyes red from weeping, though her hands clutched one another tightly, almost too tightly for genuine grief. I never left my seat, Inspector. I was speaking with Aunt Margaret about the orchids. She admired them. She said they seemed stronger this season, as though someone had been tending them specially. Then she sipped her drink and... Clara's voice broke. Miss Marple's gaze narrowed slightly. Lady Margaret had indeed mentioned orchids earlier, but not in Clara's presence. The girl was embellishing, weaving a thread that placed her closer to the victim's last words than truth allowed. It was a dangerous instinct, to appear innocent by inventing intimacy. Yet such inventions frayed quickly when tugged. Inspector Bentley scribbled in his book without looking up. So, you never touched the drinks, the glasses, the tray? No, never, Clara exclaimed, but her eyes darted fleetingly toward the sideboard before returning to the inspector. Miss Marple caught it. Clara feared that sideboard for some reason, feared it might hold a truth she did not wish revealed. The third statement, Dr. Lionel Green. Doctor, Bentley said, Papkidas, you were closest to her when she collapsed. What say you? Dr. Green adjusted his spectacles, his hand brushing the raw scratch across his knuckle. She showed no signs of illness. Her pulse was steady. Then suddenly, seizure, collapse. Could have been cardiac arrest, Inspector. A woman of her age in such heat, hardly surprising. Yet you trembled when you checked her pulse, Miss Marple observed gently, her voice soft but cutting through the silence. The doctor looked startled, then forced a smile. Shock, madam, natural shock. But Miss Marple remembered the faint oily sheen upon the broken glass, the kind a doctor might recognize at once. Green's insistence on a natural cause sounded less like diagnosis, more like deflection. The fourth statement. Victor Hensley. The lawyer straightened his cuffs before speaking, his voice cool, detached. I was reviewing some papers in my briefcase. I heard the sound, looked up, and saw Lady Margaret fall. I had no interaction with her beforehand. Papers? Bentley repeated, frowning. Yes, routine matters, Hensley replied smoothly. Miss Marple noticed the briefcase resting at his feet, its lock gleaming in the sun. It had not left his side once. Lawyers carried more than contracts. They carried secrets, too. And his eagerness to reduce his presence to routine matters rang hollow, the fifth statement. Emily Carter, Emily twisted her apron until the fabric bunched. Her voice shook. "I was at the sideboard, sir, fetching sugar. I only stepped away for a moment. Then I heard the crack, like glass breaking, and when I turned, she was already—" Emily choked, her eyes darting away. Again, Miss Marple heard the precise repetition. The words were too polished, too rehearsed. The housekeeper had told the same version earlier, nearly word for word. It was the rhythm of someone who had practiced their alibi in advance. And practice was never the friend of truth. The inspector's frustration. Inspector Bentley exhaled heavily, closing his notebook with a snap. "Useless. Each of you more nervous than the last. I'll have to cross-check everything with the staff outside. For now, stay put." The guests shifted uneasily, eyes avoiding one another. But Miss Marple leaned forward, her soft voice threading through the room. "Inspector, if I may, their stories already cross-check against themselves. The contradictions are clear enough if you care to see." Bentley frowned. "Go on, then." The contradictions unveiled. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on Julian first. "You said you returned as Margaret lifted her glass, but earlier you claimed you were present when she raised it. Which is it, Sir Julian? Were you in the room or conveniently absent?" Julian stammered. "I misremembered. Shock, that's all." Her gaze slid to Clara. "And you, my dear, you spoke of orchids, words Margaret never said in your hearing. You wished to place yourself nearer to her final moment. Why, I wonder? To prove your devotion or to distance yourself from suspicion?" Clara's lips parted, then closed again, color rushing to her cheeks. Then Miss Marple turned toward Dr. Green. "You speak of heart failure, yet your hand trembles at the glass. A doctor should recognize what that sheen meant." "Poison, Lionel. It frightened you because you knew at once." Green's face hardened, but he said nothing. Finally, she looked at Emily. "Your account is word for word the same each time. That is not grief, Emily. It is rehearsal. What was it you saw or heard that you dare not reveal?" The housekeeper's eyes welled, her lips trembling. She clutched her apron tighter, but no words came. A tightened silence stretched across the conservatory, thicker than the humid air. Each guest avoided the other's eyes, retreating into their private defenses. Yet the contradictions Miss Marple had highlighted hung heavy, undeniable. Inspector Bentley shifted uneasily. He disliked conceding ground, but he could not dismiss the old lady's clarity. "We'll continue," he muttered, scribbling again. But Miss Marple knew more than he wrote. She saw fear etched into faces, guilt twitching in fingers, secrets pressing against locked lips. And she also knew that lies, once cracked, could never be mended. They would spread like the fracture in the glass above, until the whole pane shattered. A final glimpse. As the statements wound down, Miss Marple's eyes returned to the flower on the tiles. Pure white, placed perfectly at the moment of collapse. A detail too precise to be chance. And in her mind, the pattern grew clearer. A false sound of breaking glass. A flower as distraction. A poisoned drink exchanged in that instant. And 5 guests, each tangled in lies. The inspector might still flounder in confusion, but Miss Marple was certain. The threads of this murder had already begun to unravel. Chapter 5. Clues in the Library. Part 1/3. Dust, thread, and a false crash. Approximately 1,050 words. Inspector Bentley would have preferred to keep everyone penned in the morning room, but Miss Marple, with the gentle certainty of a vicar's wife asking for the hymn number, suggested a look at the library while memories are still warm. He grumbled, checked his watch, then waved her on. A constable trailed behind, notebook ready, as if the shelves themselves might attempt an alibi. Ashcroft's library was a cool counterpoint to the bright, steamy conservatory. Oak panels drank the light, the air carried leather and beeswax, and the long windows admitted a flat, milky sun. Books, law, botany, travel lined the walls. A ladder on brass runners stood half down its rail, as if someone had stepped off in a hurry. On the hearth lay a Persian rug whose fringe had collected miscellany over the years. Lint, a dead moth's wing, a bent pin. Today it had collected one more thing, Miss Marple's attention. She moved in small, unhurried steps, eyes lowered, the way one reads a room before reading its inhabitants. Her first pause was at the inner door, the one that linked library and conservatory via a short corridor of glass. The brass strike plate bore 3 faint parallel scratches, fresh enough to glow brighter than the rest. Something thin and taut had been drawn across here recently. The edges told of pressure, movement, release. "Inspector," she said softly, "your constable mentioned the noise. Everyone described it as if glass broke beside them. Yet no great quantity of glass lies in the conservatory." Bentley folded his arms. "The goblet, perhaps. It's shattered. Enough racket for anyone." "Perhaps," Miss Marple murmured. "And yet—" She crossed to the far wall, where the tall cases rose almost to the cornice. A single volume jutted an inch farther than its neighbors. Orchids of the Southern Counties, its green cloth spine dulled by age, its title picked out in fading gold. The book wasn't simply misshelved, it had been drawn. The dust's narrow skid behind it showed recent travel. She knelt, an old woman's movement, careful and exact, and peered into the dark slit the book's displacement had opened. "Thread," she said. Bentley stooped. A black filament as fine as a hair ran from the book's inner hinge, down the back of the case, vanishing through a tiny wormhole in the oak. Miss Marple followed it with a fingertip's ghost of a touch. No more than one does with a spider's web one does not wish to break. She straightened and traced with her gaze in a slow arc, from the half-pulled book to the topmost shelf where a small wooden box sat slightly askew, to the inner door's scratched brass. "May I buy you a?" she asked. "Within reason," Bentley said, mistrust and curiosity in uneasy truce. Miss Marple rolled the ladder a fraction and climbed 2 rungs, steady as a gull on a rail. The small box on the top shelf had the dull, dusty look of something that has sat too long. But the dust was oddly even, as if it had been lightly sifted back after disturbance. She lifted the lid. Inside, cotton wadding cradled 6 empty slots the size of thin photographic plates. In one corner, lodged in the cotton's weave, glittered a single sliver. Clear, razor-edged, no bigger than a fingernail paring. "Lantern slides," she said, "or microscope plates. The sort Mr. Ashcroft might have used for his lecture last spring. Drop such a box just so, and you would have an excellent crack of breaking glass without littering the conservatory." Bentley's mustache twitched. "You're suggesting someone set those to fall? On purpose?" She clambered down and smiled mildly. "I am suggesting that a thread runs from that half-pulled book to this box, and that thread also kisses your door's brass. Pull the right thing or open the right door and the box drops." They followed the thread behind the case to a neat hole, augured long ago by woodworm, now conscripted for human schemes. On the other side, behind a sliding panel an inch off the floor, a carpenter's convenience for cables, no doubt, the thread reappeared and finished in a loop tied round a small brass tack hammered into the corridor skirting. To one side lay a little spool, black silk thread, quality stuff, its label stained but legible. Haberdashery, much Benham. A small nub of tailor's chalk, pale blue, lay beside it. "Emily Carter mends with coarse cotton," the constable offered. "Cook's girl uses cheap darning wool. This is—" He faltered under Bentley's look. Miss Marple did not. "This is the sort of thread one uses when one does not wish to be seen. And the chalk—" She lifted it, turned it. A slight impress of letters, CW, is the sort seamstresses use to mark hems without leaving a stain. Or dressmakers, or young ladies doing alterations their guardians would not approve. Bentley let out a breath. "You're building castles out of fluff, ma'am." "Fluff is what sticks when one tries to brush away one's tracks," Miss Marple replied, with a kindly air that took the sting from the words. She rose and moved to the big partner's desk beneath the window. Sir Julian's desk, if one judged by the inkstand with its crest and the blotter whose corner bore a recent line of trial signatures. A square of polished leather at the desk's edge showed a newer ring than its neighbors. A pale circle where a glass had sat long enough to dry. She lifted the edge of the blotter. A faint, bitter perfumed ghost greeted them. More suggestion than scent. Here, then gone. Almond, Bentley said grudgingly. Could be furniture polish. It could, Miss Marple agreed, though polish seldom sits in a ring the exact size of a sherry glass. He bristled. No one drank sherry in here. The service was in the conservatory. Of course, Miss Marple said, still mild. Except when something in a glass is better prepared out of sight. On the rug, near the toe of the desk, a darker stipple marked the pile. The ghost of moisture tracked on a shoe. Miss Marple set her shoe beside it for scale. The damp print's length ended in a neat chevron. A man's leather sole with a V-cut at the heel, freshly polished, with a nick in the right edge. She looked, not at the mark, but toward the corridor, the direction the print faced, as though pointing the way back to the conservatory, like an arrow drawn by chance. And there, she said quietly, eyes lowering to the skirting behind the armchair near the inner door. Someone was less careful. She crouched and reached into the narrow shadow. When her hand emerged, it carried a glove. Pale, fine, and crumpled into itself. Not rubber, not the housekeeper's rough cotton, but skin. Kid leather. The sort worn by women with good taste and small hands. Inside, at the wrist, 2 stitches had been taken hurriedly. A fray caught with pale blue thread, the same chalky hue as the tailor's nub on the floor. On the palm, a faint, slightly greasy smear, invisible until the light caught it at a certain angle. Miss Marple did not comment at once. She lifted the glove toward the window, showed Bentley the smallness of the fingers, the irregular mending, the smudge that dulled the leather's sheen. Then she turned the glove. On the inner wrist, barely there, was a darkened crescent. A print of a pressed thumbnail, like someone had pinched the glove off in haste and left their impatience behind. Whoever hid this, she said, did it quickly, and without wanting to be seen carrying such a thing. Bentley rubbed his temple and stared at the tiny theater the room had become. The black thread like a plot line, the misshelved book a cue, the box of slides an audience's gasp, the door plate the stagehand's mark, and the glove, an actress's prop, too delicate for Emily, too small for Lady Margaret, whose gloves were with her, unlikely for Miss Marple, whose gloves were wool. Clara Whitmore wore a pale blue dress today. Its hem had needed a last-minute adjust, she'd said, laughing too loudly. Even if this thread trick made a noise, Bentley said, fighting retreat, why go to such trouble? To make an instant when eyes look away, Miss Marple answered. A crash is a generous thing. It gives everyone permission to glance elsewhere. One hand to the mouth, one head turned to the ceiling, while another hand exchanges glasses. A white camellia falls to the tile, and in that heartbeat, the wrong person drinks the wrong thing. She set the glove down as if it might bruise. Then, almost as an afterthought, she walked the ladder 2 feet left and climbed a rung to the shelf where orchids of the southern counties protruded. She slid it gently back until it sat flush. The thread snugged. Then she eased it out again, only half an inch. The thread loosened. The door's latch trembled with the change, a tiny flick no louder than a spider's foot on paper. Pull the book farther and the thread would go slack at the wrong moment, she said. Set it just so, and the opening of the inner door, opened by a maid carrying sweets at precisely 12:40, would tug the loop at the skirting, pull the book forward, and let the little box kiss the floor. Not in the conservatory, no, here, in the adjoining corridor, where sound travels like gossip. Loud enough to make heads lift, not so loud as to bring eyes running away. Bentley stared at the scrapings on the brass, the looped thread, the empty slots in the slide box. He imagined the neat hands that had laid the cotton, placed the plates, measured the thread, set the book. Hands that preferred precision. Not the housekeeper's then, whose world was large gestures and heavy trays. Not Sir Julian's, who blustered and struck attitudes more than he planned. Not Victor Hensley's, a lawyer who prized concealment but whose fingers twitched for pen and seal, not chalk and silk. A doctor, perhaps, steady hands, practical mind, or a young woman who had spent nights unpicking and remaking a dress for daylight. Miss Marple drifted to the sideboard under the window, an odd piece to keep in a library, until one remembered Ashcroft's habit of pouring a better sherry for select guests away from the crowd. The cupboard smelled faintly of citrus rind and old spirit. Inside, 2 rinsed crystal goblets stood upside down on a tray. Between them, a single lip smudge remained on the silver, wiped once, then neglected, leaving a shallow crescent. Miss Marple's finger hovered over it, then stopped short. "Do you smell it?" she asked. Bentley leaned in. There it was again, that whisper of bitter almonds threaded through polish and dust. Not strong enough to shout, strong enough to remember. "Somebody prepared a drink here," he said slowly, then took it through. "Somebody prepared 2, Miss Marple corrected gently. 1 to impress, 1 to kill. The trick was not where the poison lay, but when the eyes would look away." She stepped back and let the room speak for itself. Thread taut as a nerve, book half-breathing, box poised in absence, glove silent, ring on leather drying into invisibility. The library had not witnessed the collapse. It had arranged it. "Inspector," she said, "shall we show them how a noise is made?" Chapter 5. Clues in the Library. Part 2/3. The staged sound and the silent witnesses. The library seemed to hold its breath as Miss Marple gestured to the constable by the door. "Would you be so good as to open it, dear? Slowly, as if you carried a tray." The young man blinked but obeyed. His hand pressed the brass knob. The latch stirred. Then the tiniest tug drew along the hidden thread. With a brittle snap, the box on the high shelf jerked, tilted, and tumbled. It struck the carpet with a sharp crack, one plate inside shattering audibly. Bentley swore under his breath. Even knowing what to expect, the noise startled him. In the conservatory, with glasses raised and voices murmuring, the effect would have been magnified. The instant jolt of alarm, heads lifting toward the imagined break, eyes away from Lady Margaret's hand. Miss Marple inclined her head. "You see, Inspector, a controlled distraction, disguised as accident. It lasts no longer than a heartbeat, but in that heartbeat, a glass may be exchanged, or something slipped into it." Bentley rubbed his mustache. "Ingenious. Too ingenious for most of this lot." "Perhaps," she said, "but ingenuity often hides in unexpected places, in those who are dismissed as weak or overlooked as ordinary. That is why one must never underestimate anyone in a house full of tension." Testing the theory, they examined the fragments of glass from the fallen slide. Clear, fine, not heavy enough to injure, but piercing enough to startle. Miss Marple brushed a finger along the cotton-lined box, noting how carefully the other slots had been emptied. Whoever set the trick had calculated just enough to make noise without scattering evidence. "Not Sir Julian," Bentley muttered. "He wouldn't have patience for threading a needle, let alone this." "Indeed," Miss Marple said gently, "but Clara might. Or Dr. Green, or even Mr. Hensley, whose neatness with papers suggests steady hands. And do not forget Emily, who has lived among this family's nerves for years." The inspector scowled. "So, everyone again?" "Not quite," she murmured. "Note the chalk, pale blue. I think of hems hastily shortened, seams tightened for a borrowed dress. Clara spoke of her frock needing last-minute adjusting. One wonders, who held the chalk last?" Reactions from the suspects. They returned to the conservatory, carrying the box and the glove in evidence. Bentley announced gruffly, "We've found apparatus, a thread, a weighted box, meant to mimic breaking glass. Anyone wish to explain?" The room stiffened. Julian scoffed. "Absurd. My sister's death was tragic enough without this theater of nonsense." But his laugh rang brittle, and his gaze kept darting toward the briefcase near Hensley's foot. Clara paled. Her hands clenched in her lap until her knuckles showed white. A trick? Who would do such a thing?" She forced a tremulous smile, though her eyes flickered toward the housekeeper before she caught herself. Dr. Green adjusted his spectacles. "Stage effects belong to magicians, not physicians. I cannot imagine anyone here setting threads and boxes." His hand, however, strayed unconsciously to the scratch on his knuckle, as if recalling the silk line cutting across brass. Hensley remained still, but the tightening of his jaw betrayed him. Speculation without proof is dangerous. Threads and gloves are hardly decisive. Emily Carter whispered, "I never saw a box, I swear it." But her voice carried the rehearsed note Miss Marple had noticed before. Words spoken too neatly, as if recited from memory, rather than lived. Miss Marple's demonstration. "Allow me," Miss Marple said softly. She set the box on the table, the thread still dangling from the half-pulled book she had carried along. With a simple tug, she let the box tilt again, creating the sharp crack. Everyone flinched. "You see?" she said, her eyes kind yet unyielding. "In that instant, one of you looked away. Only one, though." The room turned toward her. She nodded faintly. "Sir Julian, you turned toward the sound with relief, too eager, as though grateful for the distraction. Clara, you shrank back, clutching your dress, almost as if afraid the thread itself pointed at you." Dr. Green frowned at the mechanism, but his fingers twitched as though remembering the tension of silk. "Mr. Hensley, you did not look at the box at all. You looked instead at Clara." "Why?" The lawyer opened his mouth, then closed it again. "Because," Miss Marple continued, "you already knew what made the sound. The guilty seldom need to confirm the trick. They know its tune by heart." Bentley straightened, seizing the moment. "Well, anyone ready to speak plain?" Silence pressed. Each suspect felt the noose tighten, not yet around their necks, but dangling close enough to chill the skin. The hidden motives surface. Miss Marple's gentle voice filled the void. "Murder does not spring from nothing. It grows from soil long poisoned. Sir Julian fears his debts will be exposed, that his sister meant to disinherit him. Clara hides a desperation to secure her place in the family, afraid the truth of her adoption leaves her with nothing. Dr. Green, he has debts of another kind, financial missteps that a lady of Margaret's influence might easily uncover. Mr. Hensley, lawyers handle wills, and wills, if altered, make enemies. As for Emily, her silence tells me she knows far more than she dares, for loyalty can be as binding as greed." Her knitting needles clicked once, though the yarn in her lap was untouched. "And so each of you had reason, but only one of you tied this thread. Only one knew how to time a noise to mask the fatal exchange." Bentley barked. "We'll pin it down, piece by piece." He eyed the suspects, jotting notes furiously. But Miss Marple already saw the pattern forming, the way one sees embroidery when others see only tangled thread. A suspicious glance. It was then that Clara, attempting to look innocent, turned her head too quickly toward the glove lying on the table. The pale kid leather caught the light, the blue stitching glimmering faintly. Miss Marple caught the glance. So did Bentley. "Recognize it, do you?" he snapped. Clara shook her head violently. "No, of course not. Why would I?" Miss Marple's eyes softened, though her words did not. "Because you mended it. In haste. The blue thread, dear, it matches the chalk you used. And the size fits your hand perfectly. I dare say you thought to hide it here in the library, but panic left you careless." Clara's lips parted, then pressed shut. Her chest rose and fell rapidly. But still, she did not speak. The silence that followed was not the silence of ignorance. It was the silence of dread. End of part 2/3. Miss Marple folded her hands. "Inspector, the library has given us more than books today. It has given us lies unraveled." Bentley exhaled slowly, glaring at the suspects. "Then tomorrow night, we'll reenact the whole blasted thing. Let's see who flinches when the clock strikes." Miss Marple only nodded, her eyes never leaving Clara's trembling hands. The truth was circling closer, like a hawk descending on its prey. Chapter 5. Clues in the Library. Part 3/3. The pattern emerges. The library had surrendered more than dust and silence. It had begun to whisper. The glove, the thread, the scratch upon brass, all threads in a larger tapestry. Yet a tapestry, Miss Marple knew, only reveals its picture when one steps back. Inspector Bentley leaned heavily against the desk, his notebook bristling with half-legible scrawls. "We've got fragments, ma'am. A glove here, a thread there, a glass ring, but no blasted rope to tie them." Miss Marple's needles clicked once in her lap, though no wool ran between them. "On the contrary, Inspector, the rope is already tied. One need only follow its knots." Reconstructing the timeline. She asked the constable to place the broken slide fragments in a row on the table. The shards caught light like cold fire. The box was positioned deliberately. It fell when the door opened at 12:40. That noise made all eyes turn, except the guilty one who already knew what to expect. In that moment, the poisoned glass was set before Lady Margaret. Bentley scowled. "And who handled the glasses? Servants brought them in. Guests raised them themselves." "Just so," Miss Marple said, "But recall, Emily claimed she went to fetch flowers at that exact time. A coincidence, she insists. Yet the thread was anchored at skirting height, where a woman bending to pick stems might plausibly pass a hand. She could not have failed to notice." Emily flushed, twisting her apron. "I swear, madam, I only fetched orchids. I never touched no books, no threads." "Perhaps not," Miss Marple said gently. "But you saw who did." The housekeeper's mouth snapped shut. Her eyes lowered, silence thickening like wet wool. Sir Julian's alibi unravels. Miss Marple shifted her gaze to Sir Julian. "You spoke of walking in the garden when the glass fell, yet your shoe left its mark in the rug here. A chevron sole, freshly polished, with a nick on the right edge. Remarkably like your boots." Julian stiffened. "I may have passed through earlier, hours before. I read in here that morning." "Indeed? Then the moisture that stained the pile must have waited obediently all that time." Her tone was mild, but her eyes pierced. "No, Sir Julian, that step was fresh, just before or just after the fatal moment." "You were here," he blustered. "Rubbish. You can't hang a man for damp carpet." "No," Miss Marple agreed, "but one can note that you looked to the lawyer's case the instant the noise came. Not at your sister, at her will. Fear is a loud companion, Sir Julian." His face mottled red, but words deserted him. Clara's fraying composure. Clara, seated by the window, looked as though the light itself accused her. The glove lay inches from her hand. Its pale leather seemed to glow with blame. Miss Marple leaned forward. "This glove bears the blue stitch of your own work, Clara. A hurried mend. I suspect you dropped it when panic overcame caution. It is not proof alone, but it shows you were near enough to the mechanism." Clara's lips trembled. I sewed it weeks ago. It could have fallen at any time." Miss Marple's voice remained kind. "My dear, if that were so, why did your eyes leap toward it the moment it was uncovered?" Clara covered her mouth with both hands as though holding back words. Tears pressed against her lashes but refused to fall. The doctor and the bitter almond Inspector Bentley turned suddenly on Dr. Green. "And you, doctor, what of the scratch on your hand?" "A thread burn, if ever I saw one." Green's jaw tightened. "A thorn from the garden. I told you." Miss Marple's voice slid in quietly. "And yet you were first to Lady Margaret's side. You declared heart failure, too quickly, too simply. The scent of bitter almonds clung still to the goblet. You, of all men, should not have missed it, unless you wished to bury it beneath your diagnosis." Green's hand clenched, the scratch whitening under strain. "I treated her faithfully for years. You insult me." "Not insult," Miss Marple said softly. "Observation. For loyalty is proven in honesty, not in hasty verdicts." The lawyer's calculated silence. Finally, her gaze rested on Victor Hensley. The lawyer's composure was iron, but iron bends under heat. "You hold the will," Miss Marple said. "You know what it says, though you have not yet revealed it. When the box fell, you looked not at Lady Margaret but at Clara. Why?" Hensley adjusted his glasses. "I looked at nothing in particular." "But you did," she said gently, "because you knew the will favored her. And if Lady Margaret lived even one day longer, she might alter it again, perhaps in Julian's favor or in Charity's. That is why you watched Clara. You wondered if she knew. You wondered if she had acted. His lips tightened. He neither denied nor confessed, and that silence spoke volumes. The threads converge. Miss Marple drew a slow breath. It is no single clue that condemns. It is their pattern. A glove stitched with blue thread. A box set to crash at 12:40. A print upon a rug. A glass that smelled of almonds. Lies rehearsed. Eyes that dart where they ought not. Piece by piece, these scraps of thread weave together, and the picture they form. She stopped, allowing silence to swell. The suspects shifted uneasily, each wondering if the picture bore their likeness. The picture they form, she finished, is of intent, deliberation, murder, arranged like clockwork. A plan for the reenactment. Inspector Bentley slammed his notebook shut. Enough riddles. Tomorrow night, we'll gather you all here at the same hour. We'll open the doors, let the noise fall, and see who falters. A reenactment, Miss Marple. If you can catch them in the act, by heaven, I'll see them in irons. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes calm. Murderers may hide behind lies, Inspector, but lies stumble when asked to walk the same path twice. Let us give them that path. Her gaze drifted once more to the glove, to Clara's trembling shoulders, to Julian's red face, Green's clenched jaw, Hensley's stillness, Emily's downcast eyes. Any one of them could still be guilty. But soon, when the threads were tugged again, the tapestry would reveal its pattern in full. And when it did, no disguise would hold. Chapter 6. Beneath the Conservatory's Glass. Part 1/2. The Unveiling of Motives. The night had drawn down over Ashcroft Manor like a heavy curtain, but inside the conservatory the lamps glowed with a strange, unnatural brilliance. The great glass dome reflected the light back upon itself, so that every leaf seemed to shimmer with a pale sheen, and every shadow looked sharper than it should. Inspector Bentley, tired from endless interviews, sat at the head of the long table. His mustache drooped in fatigue, but his eyes remained keen. Around him, the guests were gathered yet again. Sir Julian restless, Clara pale and withdrawn, Dr. Green chewing at the inside of his cheek, Victor Hensley calm but coiled, and Emily Carter wringing her apron until the fabric seemed near to tearing. Miss Marple, quiet as ever, had taken the smallest chair at the edge of the gathering, but though her frame was slight, her presence seemed to fill the room. A new kind of discovery. "Ma'am," Bentley said, turning to her, "you hinted there was something beyond gloves and threads and glasses. What is it you're holding back?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "Not holding back, Inspector. Waiting for the right moment." She reached into her knitting bag, not for wool, but for a small folded paper she had been carrying since the afternoon. It was not a letter. It was a receipt, faded, issued from a botanical society in London. Lady Margaret, Miss Marple said softly, was not merely a gracious hostess. She was a patron of science. For the past year, she funded research into exotic orchids, rare breeds cultivated here under this very glass roof. And, this is the part most of you did not know, she had agreed to sell part of her collection, a new hybrid with peculiar medicinal properties, to an international firm for a staggering sum. The room stirred. Julian's head snapped up, Clara's lips parted, Hensley sat forward an inch too quickly, and Dr. Green went pale. Miss Marple went on. Tomorrow she meant to announce it. The funds would not be poured into family comforts, but into a trust, one dedicated to research. She had hinted to me herself, only hours before her death, that she expected resistance, ripples of reaction. Julian slammed a fist against the table. Nonsense. She would never squander family wealth on foreign buyers. This estate has stood for generations. Hensley's calm voice slipped in, smooth as oil. And yet she had every right, Sir Julian. She owned the collection. If her signature was upon that receipt, then the matter was settled in law. Dr. Green swallowed visibly. Medicinal properties, you say? That could not be confirmed, not safely. His protest lacked conviction, and Miss Marple's gaze lingered on him with sharp interest. Clara whispered, "But she never told us. Not me, not anyone. Why?" Her voice cracked on the last word, more wounded than indignant. "Because," Miss Marple answered gently, "she knew secrecy was her shield, and because she feared what the truth would provoke." The botany ledger. From her knitting bag, Miss Marple produced a second item, a ledger, not hidden but left carelessly in the library desk. It was not a letter, she said, but a book of notes, purchases of rare soil compounds, orders for unusual fertilizers, correspondence with foreign scientists. And in the margin, a curious phrase she underlined twice. Breakthrough patent, green to review. The doctor stiffened. That was scientific speculation only. Margaret asked me to glance at her notes, nothing formal. But she trusted you, Miss Marple said softly, enough to let you evaluate whether the orchid compound might indeed serve as medicine. A discovery that, if patented, could be worth millions. Tell me, doctor, did you fear she would cut you out of the credit? Or did you fear she would reveal just how much you had already borrowed against her generosity? Green's face blanched whiter still. The human tangles Inspector Bentley barked. Well, that's a motive if I've ever heard one. Greed, pride, and science turned sour. But Miss Marple raised a hand. Not only the doctor, consider Clara. If Margaret gave her heart to science, what would remain for her ward? You, my dear, were already anxious, fearing your place in this family uncertain. What future did you imagine if Margaret gave the orchids to strangers? Clara's breath hitched. She promised. I thought she promised. I would be secure. Sir Julian growled. Secure? She was about to bankrupt us all for orchids. The Fairfax name reduced to a gardener's note in some foreign catalog. Miss Marple's eyes rested on him. And you, Sir Julian, had debts of your own. A tidy infusion from that sale might have cleared them, but Margaret's intention was clear. Not a penny for you. Resentment is a strong ferment. Julian's face turned crimson, but he said nothing more. Hensley finally spoke, his tone lawyerly, measured. What I see, Inspector, is an agreement not yet finalized. If Lady Margaret perished before signing, then her estate remains intact. In such matters, the difference between one day and the next is everything. His words fell into silence like stones. Even Bentley's frown could not disguise the weight of them. Miss Marple's quiet net. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. And so we see the pattern, Inspector. Not hidden letters, but hidden ambitions. Each person here had reason to wish Margaret silenced before she announced her plan. Each person had something to lose, or something to gain, by her death. Bentley scribbled furiously in his notebook. A fortune in flowers. Enough motive to fill the docks at Old Bailey. But we'll need more than motive, ma'am. We'll need the hand that tied the knot, so to speak. Miss Marple's eyes glimmered. And that, Inspector, will emerge when the web is tugged. Already, it frays. Her gaze flickered toward Clara, who twisted her dress hem until the threads pulled loose. Then to Julian, whose eyes betrayed a hunger he could not conceal. Then to Green, pale with fear of exposure, and Hensley, whose silence had become heavier than words. Chapter 6. Beneath the conservatory's glass. Part 2 halves. Contradictions and the looming reenactment. The heavy silence that followed Miss Marple's revelation pressed upon the conservatory like a weight. Outside, the moon's light spilled through the dome, silvering the leaves of orchids that swayed ever so slightly in the night air. The family and guests seemed frozen, each one caught in the glow of suspicion, each breath too loud in the hush. Inspector Bentley broke it first. We've got motives sprouting like weeds, but we'll need more than that. We'll need cracks in their stories. Lies never fit as neatly as truth. Miss Marple nodded, her needles still and silent upon her lap. Then let us look closer, Inspector. The cracks are already there. Clara's uneasy story, she turned her gaze to Clara, who sat twisting her dress hem until threads frayed. My dear, you told us you left the table when the sound of breaking glass startled you, that you ran to fetch Emily for help. But Emily has said she was already near the orchids at the far side of the conservatory, trimming stems. She recalls you arriving much later, breathless, as if you had been elsewhere before you remembered your excuse. Clara's eyes widened, her lips trembling. I was confused. Everything happened so quickly. Confusion does not change the clock, Miss Marple said gently. You disappeared for 5 minutes, a long time, when death needs but seconds. Clara's fingers tightened upon the torn hem, but she said nothing more at Sir Julian's anger. Next, Miss Marple shifted to Sir Julian. You claimed to be pacing the gallery outside the conservatory, angry after Margaret's announcement, yet one of the maids clearing dishes swore she nearly bumped into you by the library door at precisely 12:40, when the noise of glass broke. The library, Sir Julian, not the gallery. Julian bristled. That girl must be mistaken. Servants are always mistaken when it suits them. Bentley's mustache bristled. Watch your tongue, sir. These mistaken servants might just save your neck from the rope. Julian flushed crimson, muttering under his breath, but the damage was done. His alibi now hung by the thinnest of threads. Dr. Green's slipping mask, Miss Marple's eyes moved next to Dr. Green. You rushed to Lady Margaret's side, pronouncing heart failure. Too quickly. You said you were nearest, that you alone noticed her collapse first. Yet Clara insists she saw the glass slip from Margaret's hand before you moved. If so, you could not have been as close as you claim. Why tell a tale of nearness when you were not? Green's hands tightened on the table edge. I misremembered. Shock does that. Or guilt, Bentley muttered darkly. The doctor's gaze dropped, his jaw clenched, but he did not argue further. The lawyer's silence. Victor Hensley had remained the stillest of them all, his hands folded neatly upon the table, his face unreadable. Miss Marple addressed him last. You, sir, are the custodian of truth. Legal truth, at least. Yet your silence condemns you more than your words. You knew of Lady Margaret's agreement with the Botanical Society. You alone read the draft contracts. Why tell the inspector earlier that her affairs were in perfect order when you knew a storm was brewing? Hensley's lips curved faintly, the nearest thing to a smile. Because, madam, clients' dealings are confidential. I am bound by law. Miss Marple's expression softened, but her words were sharp. The law does not bind your eyes. And your eyes, Mr. Hensley, betrayed you when the glass fell. You looked not at Margaret, but at Clara. If you were bound by law, you were unbound by fear. Fear of what she might reveal. For the first time, Hensley's composure cracked. His gaze flickered downward, and he tugged once at his cuff. Emily's whisper. Finally, Miss Marple looked toward Emily, the housekeeper. You told us you were trimming orchids, yes? That you heard the shatter and turned, only to see Lady Margaret fall. Yet, my dear, you also said you smelled almonds at that moment. How could you from the far corner with all the orchid's fragrance around you? Emily's eyes widened, panic flaring. I don't know. Perhaps I imagined it. No, Miss Marple said gently. You knew because you were nearer than you claimed. And if you were nearer, then you saw more than you've admitted. Perhaps not guilt, but fear of telling the whole truth. Fear of who else stood beside you. Emily began to weep silently, her hands trembling in her lap. She would say no more, but the effect was clear. The inspector's plan. Bentley slapped his notebook shut. That's it. Enough of dodges and contradictions. Tomorrow night, we'll set the stage exactly as it was. Every chair in its place, every glass on the table, the thread, the box. And each of you will take your seat as you did. We'll watch, we'll listen, and God help the one who falters. Julian sneered. You think children's theater will prove anything? Bentley growled. A guilty conscience is a poor actor. We'll see whose mask slips. Miss Marple's quiet assurance. Miss Marple rose, her knitting bag clutched lightly at her side. Her voice was calm, almost grandmotherly. Murder thrives in confusion, Inspector. But confusion vanishes when light is cast twice upon the same scene. The killer believes they've hidden well, yet ask them to walk again through their steps, and they will stumble. They always stumble. Her gaze moved slowly from face to face. Julian sweating, Clara pale and trembling, Green silent and tight-lipped, Hensley polished but shaken, Emily still sobbing softly. Each bore guilt of some sort, fear, pride, or greed, but only one bore the weight of murder. And tomorrow night, under the same glass roof that had borne witness to death, the truth would be forced into the open. Chapter 7. The Night Reenactment. Part 1/3. Gathering Under Glass. The following evening, Ashcroft Manor felt like a stage prepared for tragedy. The conservatory, once a place of warmth and light, now looked transformed under deliberate arrangement. The long table had been set again, exactly as it had been on the afternoon of Lady Margaret's death. Crystal goblets gleamed under the lamplight. Silver cutlery reflected distorted images of those who dared glance down. Orchids swayed faintly in their pots, their blossoms too pale, almost ghostly under the night's glow. Inspector Bentley had commanded the staff to reproduce every detail. Even the fallen slide box, carefully reconstructed, sat precariously balanced upon the cabinet by the entrance, ready to tumble with the same harsh clatter at the appointed hour. A grandfather clock was wheeled in from the hall and positioned prominently, its pendulum swaying like the heartbeat of the room. At exactly 12:40, its chime would mark the moment of truth. The suspects assembled with varying degrees of reluctance. Sir Julian entered first, blustering as ever, his heavy boots clomping upon the tiled floor. He muttered about damned theatrics and public humiliation, yet he was the first to sit, pouring himself a drink with trembling fingers that betrayed his nerves. Clara drifted in soon after, her pale face drawn as though she had not slept. She clutched her shawl tight about her shoulders, her eyes darting toward the table as though it were a gallows. Dr. Green arrived next, stiff-backed, his medical bag dangling at his side like a shield. He nodded curtly to the inspector, then took his seat, his lips pressed thin, his gaze fixed anywhere but the empty chair once belonging to Lady Margaret. Emily Carter hovered at the doorway, reluctant, until Bentley's growl ushered her in. She obeyed, settling nervously near the orchids, hands already worrying at her apron. Victor Hensley, last of all, stepped in with deliberate composure, as though the very act of punctuality gave him advantage. His eyes swept the room, cool and calculating, before he seated himself with a lawyer's grace, fingers steepled before him. And then, as if unnoticed until that very moment, Miss Marple entered. She was unhurried, her steps steady, her knitting bag tucked under one arm. She paused by the doorway, surveying the conservatory with quiet eyes that seemed to drink in every corner, every reflection upon the glass. When she finally sat, it was not at the head of the table, but at the margin near the shadows, yet her presence anchored the entire room. The inspector's command Bentley stood, clearing his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen, you know why you're here. Last night, each of you gave testimony, and each testimony bears cracks. Tonight, you will walk again the path of your words. You will sit where you sat. You will act as you acted. And when the clock strikes 12:40, the truth will break as surely as that glass did." Julian snorted. "You'll get nothing but the same stories, Inspector." Bentley's mustache twitched. "Then you've nothing to fear, Sir Julian, unless the story changes." He gestured, and constables moved about the room, ensuring every chair was precisely placed, every goblet aligned, every orchid positioned. One even laid a white flower gently upon the table beside the place where Lady Margaret had once sat. The sight of it drew a collective shiver. The first movements, Miss Marple's voice, calm but firm, broke the silence. "We shall begin at the hour before the tragedy. Lady Margaret hosted her luncheon here. Each of you conversed, argued, or excused yourself in turn. Let us see it again." Her gaze moved to Emily first. "You, my dear, spoke of tending the orchids." Emily rose reluctantly, smoothing her apron. She walked to the far corner where orchids spilled from pots in wild profusion. I trimmed here, as I said." She took up a pair of shears from the shelf, cutting a stem shakily. Yet her eyes flickered toward the table and her hand trembled enough that the stem fell limp to the floor. Miss Marple's sharp gaze caught it. "You looked away at the sound of glass," you said, but the glass had not yet fallen. "Why glance so soon unless you knew it would?" Emily stammered, but Bentley barked, "Sit down, woman. We'll come back to you." Next, Clara was asked to rise. She did so reluctantly, her shawl slipping from her shoulders. "I went to fetch Emily," she whispered, "when I heard the noise." Miss Marple corrected gently, "But you left the table before, 5 minutes before. Where were you in those missing moments, Clara?" Clara's face flushed crimson. I wandered the hall. I needed air." "Then why?" Marple asked. "Did your shoes leave a faint trace of soil near the cabinet, where the box was rigged? Soil from the orchids, pressed into the rug. A trace that could only be yours, for you alone walked barefoot in the conservatory earlier that day." Clara gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She sank back into her chair, silent, as the others shifted uncomfortably. Sir Julian's bluster. "Enough of this," Julian barked, rising. "Are we to watch her torment us one by one? This is theater, not justice." Miss Marple's eyes were steady. "Theater, Sir Julian, has a way of revealing truths no one wishes to speak." She gestured toward his seat. "Now recall where you stood when the crash came." Julian folded his arms. "In the gallery, I told you." "Then why did the maid see you near the library door at 12:40? Julian slammed a fist against the table. "Servants lie," Bentley thundered. "And gentlemen in debt do not?" His voice cracked like a whip. Julian faltered, his bluster crumbling into muttered curses. He sank back, refusing to meet anyone's eye. "Does the doctor's diagnosis now?" Miss Marple turned to Dr. Green. "You pronounced heart failure. Too quickly, too simply. Repeat your actions, doctor." Green rose stiffly, moving to the chair where Lady Margaret had sat. He pantomimed checking her pulse, pressing fingers to air. She collapsed. "I was closest. I did what any physician must." "But Clara saw the glass slip before you rose. How could you be closest?" Marple asked. Green's lips tightened. Perhaps she misremembered. Miss Marple's gaze did not waver. "Or perhaps you lied. You were not nearest, but you wished to claim control, to cloak poison in diagnosis, to bury truth beneath medicine." Green froze, his face gray, before lowering himself heavily into his seat, thus the lawyer's calculation. Lastly, she turned to Hensley. "And you, sir, you sat here, papers before you, eyes upon Clara when the box fell. Show us again." Hensley rose, folding his hands behind his back. His composure was unbroken. "I did nothing more than look across the table." "But you looked in fear, not in surprise," Marple said. "Fear of a truth that would unseat you. Tell me, Mr. Hensley, why did you not so much as glance at Lady Margaret as she fell?" For the first time, the lawyer faltered. His throat bobbed in a swallow, and his gaze dropped to the floor. The stage is set. The grandfather clock chimed 12:30, its echo rolling through the conservatory like thunder. The moment of reenactment drew near. Each suspect sat rigid, the air thick with dread. The orchids seemed to lean closer, their pale blossoms like faces watching silently. Miss Marple folded her hands atop her knitting bag. "When the clock strikes 12:40, we shall see again what transpired. The guilty hand cannot help but betray itself when forced to repeat its crime." The suspects shifted, restless, caught between defiance and fear. Sir Julian mopped his brow. Clara stared at her lap. Green's fingers tapped nervously. Hensley's composure frayed by inches. Emily wept softly into her apron. And Miss Marple waited, calm, like a shepherd with all her flock gathered. The trap had been laid, the stage prepared. The clock's pendulum swung, steady, merciless. Chapter 7. The Night Reenactment, Part 2/3. The chime approaches. The pendulum of the grandfather clock swung with deliberate inevitability, its steady tick-tock filling the glass dome with a rhythm that pressed against every ear. The suspect sat stiff and restless, as if bound not by rope, but by the weight of silence. Inspector Bentley stood at the head of the table, arms folded, eyes sharp as a hawk's. He glanced at the clock. 10 minutes to the hour, he announced. 10 minutes until we relive every detail. For now, remain where you sat. Speak when spoken to. And remember, falsehood has shorter legs than truth. Miss Marple, seated in her small chair near the shadowed corner, nodded gently. Her knitting bag lay folded upon her lap, unopened. She needed no yarn tonight. The people before her would unravel on their own. The atmosphere tightens. The conservatory itself seemed complicit in the drama. The orchids, pale and luminous beneath the lamps, gave off a faint perfume that clung to the air. Drops of condensation slid down the glass panes, distorting the moonlight into wavering streaks. It was as if the very walls of glass were watching, waiting for confession. Clara's breathing came fast and shallow. She pulled her shawl tighter, though the air was warm. Every so often, her gaze darted to the cabinet where the box had been rigged the night before, as if fearing it might fall again. Sir Julian shifted heavily in his seat, grumbling under his breath. Yet his hands betrayed him. They drummed upon the table, too quickly, too loudly. Dr. Green dabbed his forehead with a handkerchief, his eyes flicking from clock to table and back again. Each tick of the pendulum seemed to strike him like a blow. Victor Hensley maintained his careful poise, though Miss Marple noticed the faintest tremor in his hand as he adjusted his cufflinks. Emily, the maid, sat with her apron balled between her fists, eyes lowered, lips moving soundlessly in whispered prayer. Reconstructing the scene. Miss Marple's voice broke the tension, calm yet commanding. Let us begin again, step by step, exactly as it was. At 12:30, the luncheon was nearly concluded. Lady Margaret rose to make her announcement. Each of you remembers the words. Speak them. Bentley nodded sharply. Repeat them. Julian groaned. This is absurd. Speak them, Bentley snapped. Reluctantly, Julian rose, towering, and recited in a mocking falsetto, I have decided the orchids will be sold. The proceeds placed into a research trust. The words, echoing under glass, chilled the room. Clara flinched. Green's lips pressed thinner. Hensley adjusted his cuffs once more. Miss Marple's eyes moved to Clara. And what did you do next? Clara swallowed hard. I excused myself. I said I felt faint. Walk where you walked, Miss Marple instructed. Clara stood, trembling, and drifted toward the far side of the conservatory. Yet her steps faltered. She veered too near the cabinet. Miss Marple noted it, her gaze sharpening, but she said nothing. Not yet. The inspector's trap Bentley motioned to Emily. You, girl, show us how you trimmed the orchids. Emily obeyed, taking the shears from the shelf. Her hands shook so violently that the stem she cut splintered. I was here, she whispered. I stayed here. Then why? Bentley barked. Did you tell us yesterday that you smelled almonds from across the room? Emily froze, her eyes darting wildly. I must have been mistaken. Or nearer than you admitted, Bentley shot back. Closer to Margaret when she fell. Emily burst into tears, shaking her head furiously, but the sound of her sobs only added to the oppressive weight in the room. Miss Marple's subtle guidance. Miss Marple lifted her voice gently, guiding the reenactment forward. Doctor, recall your part. Green rose reluctantly. I heard the glass shatter. I turned, saw her collapse, and rushed forward. I checked her pulse. Show us, Miss Marple said. Green moved stiffly to Margaret's empty chair, pantomiming the gesture. Yet he bent too quickly, too surely, as though rehearsed rather than remembered. Strange, Marple murmured. You claim you were nearest, but Clara insists she saw the glass fall before you moved. Which is true. Green's face blanched. She misremembers. The shock of the moment. Miss Marple leaned forward. Or the shock is yours, Doctor. You were not the closest, but you wished to appear so. to cloak the truth in the authority of medicine. Green's hand trembled visibly now at Julian's outburst. Sir Julian slammed his fist upon the table. Enough of this charade. We are made fools, while that old woman spins tales. Miss Marple's gaze flicked to him calmly. Then show us, Sir Julian. Where did you pace when the glass fell? Julian hesitated, then stomped toward the gallery doors. Yet one of Bentley's constables blocked him. Not there, sir. By the library, wasn't it? Julian's jaw worked furiously, his face purple. The maid lied. Or you did, Bentley growled. Julian returned to his seat in seething silence, sweat glistening upon his brow, the lawyer's turn. Finally, Miss Marple addressed Hensley. And you, sir? When the crash came, you looked not at Margaret, but at Clara. Do it again. Hensley rose with deliberate composure. He folded his hands behind his back, glanced across the table toward Clara. But his gaze lingered too long, too heavy with unspoken fear. Marple's voice was quiet, but each word fell like a stone. Fear does not lie easily, Mr. Hensley. You knew she held something that could undo you. Hensley's face remained calm, but the flicker of his eyes betrayed unease. The clock ticks on, the pendulum swung. Tick-tock, the air grew heavier with each passing second. The suspects returned to their seats, though no one looked at one another. Clara twisted her shawl to shreds. Julian stared at the floor, jaw clenched. Green tapped his fingers, a rhythm betraying his nerves. Hensley's mask of calm cracked by inches. Emily sobbed quietly into her apron. Miss Marple sat serenely, her gaze moving from one face to the next. She had seen all she needed, though the final snare was yet to spring. The clock struck 12:35. The chime rolled through the conservatory, deep and resonant. 5 minutes remained. The air thickened, as though even the orchids held their breath. Bentley's voice was low, grim. 5 minutes, ladies and gentlemen. When the clock strikes 12:40, we shall see whether truth can hide behind lies. The guilty hand will tremble, the guilty eye will flinch, and we will be watching. Foreshadow of collapse. Miss Marple leaned forward, her knitting bag unopened. It is remarkable, Inspector, how truth behaves. Like the orchids, it may lie dormant in shadow, but once brought into light, it blooms quickly. Tonight, truth will bloom, whether or not it is wanted. Her words hung in the air, more chilling than threat. The suspects shifted again, each caught in their own cage of fear. Julian's scowl, Clara's pale trembling, Green's damp brow, Hensley's fleeting glances, Emily's desperate sobs. All were guilty of something, but only one bore the weight of murder. The pendulum swung on, tick, tock. And above, the moonlight shimmered through the glass, casting fractured beams across the table like prison bars. Chapter 7. The Night Reenactment. Part 3/3. The culprit exposed. The grandfather clock loomed, its pendulum swinging with relentless certainty. Each tick was a nail, each tock a hammer. The air in the conservatory had thickened into something almost tangible. Every orchid seemed to lean forward, pale blossoms like faces waiting for judgment. The clock's hands reached the moment. 12:40. The chime rang out, deep and resonant, echoing through the glass dome. At that exact instant, Bentley gave a sharp nod. One constable brushed past the cabinet, jarring the precariously balanced slide box. It toppled with a loud clatter, hitting the floor with the same harsh crack that had startled them all the night of Margaret's death. The sound ripped through the room. Clara gasped, clutching her shawl. Julian lurched, knocking over his glass. Emily shrieked and covered her face. Green froze, his hand halfway to his pocket. But Victor Hensley, ever so composed, did something damning. He flinched. Not toward the crash, not toward the empty chair where Margaret had once sat. His eyes shot sideways, to Clara. The fatal tell, Miss Marple's voice cut through the silence, calm yet sharp as a blade. There, did you see it? Every head turned. Bentley barked, "What?" Marple's gaze locked on Hensley. Not one of you looked at Margaret's chair when the crash came. Fear and shock carried your eyes elsewhere. But Hensley, his went straight to Clara. Not once, not twice, but each time the sound has been mentioned. A guilty conscience does not look where it ought. It looks where it fears. Clara whimpered, shrinking back. Hensley's mask of calm began to fracture. "Ridiculous," he said, his voice brittle. "Coincidence." Marple leaned forward. Coincidence does not stain a man's cuff with wax from a candle he never lit. Coincidence does not place soil from orchid pots upon shoes he swears never touched the conservatory floor. Coincidence does not explain why Margaret, moments before her collapse, whispered, "You betrayed me," words heard by Emily, though she dared not repeat them until tonight. Emily sobbed louder, nodding helplessly. The evidence Bentley's eyes narrowed. "You've got more than words, don't you, Miss Marple?" She opened her knitting bag, producing a folded handkerchief. Inside lay a shard of glass from the fallen goblet, faintly smeared. "This fragment bears not only Margaret's fingerprints, but his," she gestured toward Hensley. "Why touch her glass unless to taint it? Why wipe it hastily, leaving only partial prints beneath the rim?" Gasps broke from the group. Green muttered, "Poisoned." "Yes," Marple said softly. A tincture slipped into her drink, bitter but masked by the orchid's perfume and the taste of wine. That is why Emily thought she smelled almonds. It was not fancy, but the faint trace of cyanide. And who but her lawyer had both motive and means? For Margaret had begun to suspect him, had threatened to reveal his manipulations of her finances. Her death meant silence, and the continuation of his schemes. Hensley's defense. Victor Hensley's face hardened. He rose slowly, his composure cracking but not yet broken. "Lies," he spat. "Circumstance and hysteria. A trembling maid's imagination, an old woman's guesswork. You have nothing that would stand in court." Bentley bristled. "We'll see what a jury says." But Marple's eyes did not leave him. Her voice dropped, almost gentle. "You forgot one thing, Mr. Hensley, the cabinet. You rigged the box so it would fall at precisely 12:40, drawing every eye and ear. It gave you the cover to pour the tincture into her glass, to mask the sound of liquid with the crash of glass. Clever, but not clever enough. You rehearsed it too well. Tonight, when the box fell, your eyes betrayed you. You looked to Clara, your unwilling accomplice. She knew too much, did she not?" Clara burst into sobs. "He told me not to speak. He said if I did, he'd ruin me. I saw him by the table when the glass fell. I saw him lean near her goblet." The collapse. The room erupted. Julian shouting, Green swearing, Emily crying. Bentley thundered for silence. Hensley's mask finally shattered. He slammed his fist on the table, his voice rising with fury. Yes, I did it. She would have exposed me, stripped everything I'd built. Decades of work, of careful investment, gone. Just because she fancied herself a patron saint of orchids and charities. I could not let her destroy me. His voice cracked into rage. She trusted me, and still she turned on me. So I gave her justice of my own, a sip, a single sip, and she was mine to silence. Clara sobbed uncontrollably. Julian muttered curses. Emily covered her face. Green sat pale as chalk. Inspector Bentley strode forward, seizing Hensley's arm. You've confessed enough to hang a man twice over. Constables, take him. They moved in, clamping irons upon his wrists. For the first time, Hensley faltered, his shoulders slumping, the weight of his crime crushing him. He no longer looked like the polished lawyer. He looked like a broken man. Miss Marple's reflection. As the constables dragged him away, Miss Marple remained seated, her expression calm, her eyes thoughtful. She spoke softly, almost to herself, but the room heard. Murder is not merely the end of one life. It poisons all who stand near it. Greed, pride, fear, they creep like vines until they choke even the purest orchids. The grandfather clock's pendulum swung on, steady, indifferent. The conservatory, bathed in moonlight, seemed to exhale at last. The reenactment had ended, not with theater, but with truth. Chapter 8, The Full Confession. The stone walls of the village jail absorbed every sound. The flickering lantern cast long shadows across the small interrogation room, where the smell of damp stone mingled with the metallic tang of iron bars. A single chair sat opposite the table, its wood scarred by years of confessions and denials. Tonight, it held Victor Hensley. Gone was the polished lawyer with immaculate poise. His coat hung loose, his hair damp with sweat. Iron shackles clinked softly at his wrists, the sound punctuating the heavy silence. Across from him sat Inspector Bentley, arms folded, mustache bristling with grim satisfaction. To his right, Miss Marple sat quietly, her knitting bag at her feet. She had insisted on attending, not to gloat, but to listen. Bentley leaned forward, voice rough. "You admitted enough last night to hang yourself, but the law requires more than a burst of temper. So we'll have it properly, Hensley. Every step, every thought, every lie that brought you here. You'll speak it now." Victor gave a hollow laugh. "Confession. Isn't that what you people crave? Not justice, not truth, just the theater of guilt." Miss Marple's voice, soft and steady, cut through the bitterness. "It is not theater, Mr. Hensley. It is clarity, and clarity at last might give peace to Lady Margaret, to those she left behind, perhaps even to you." The first cracks, Victor's hands tightened upon the table. His eyes flicked toward Marple, then away. "You think peace exists for me? After this, after rope or cell, there is only the slow gnaw of regret." Bentley slammed his palm flat. "Regret won't spare your neck, speak." Victor's voice dropped low, resigned. "Very well. You want the tale? You shall have it. It began long before that luncheon. Years of service, years of loyalty to Margaret Fairfax. Drafting her papers, protecting her assets, guiding her fortune. And what was I in return? A servant in a fine suit, a solicitor who lived by her whim." He spat the word like venom, the motive unveiled. "She grew restless, you see," he continued. "Old age sharpened her conscience. She spoke of legacy, of charity, of giving away what I had built. Orchids, for heaven's sake, orchids and scholars. As if flowers and dusty students could guard the Fairfax fortune better than I had. She told me she was altering her will, cutting me out, cutting everyone out. Her own kin might suffer, but I, her trusted advisor, was to be left with nothing, not even gratitude." His voice grew ragged, trembling with anger that still simmered. "Do you know what it is to watch everything you've schemed for? Every late-night calculation, every risk, every deception, slip from your grasp with a single stroke of her pen? To see a fortune dangled, then swept away?" Bentley growled, "So you poisoned her?" Victor's jaw clenched. "Yes. I found the tincture months ago. A client's estate. He dealt in chemicals. I knew its taste, its smell, the faint almonds it left. Strong, reliable, swift. I kept it, hidden for a moment of necessity." The night in detail. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "And you chose the luncheon. Why?" Victor leaned back, chains rattling. "Because it was public, because it was noisy, because in noise one can hide. I rigged the slide box by the cabinet that morning. A thin cord, almost invisible. A tug at the right moment and it would fall, shattering against the floor, drawing every eye." His lip curled. "And it worked. At 12:40, as the clock chimed, I pulled the cord from beneath the table. The crash came, gasps, cries, and in that heartbeat of chaos, I leaned near her glass. Just a few drops. Then I leaned back, calm as you please, as though nothing had happened. She drank soon after." His breath grew heavier. "It was perfect, except she looked at me, at the very end, as if she knew. She whispered, 'You betrayed me,' and for that instant, I felt naked, exposed, But it was too late. The web of lies. Inspector Bentley scribbled notes, though his eyes never left Victor. And the rest? The lies you told us all? Victor gave a bitter smile. Easier than I expected. Julian's debts, Clara's weakness, Green's ambition, Emily's fear, they all lied in their own ways. It was simple to weave their threads into a noose. Clara, especially. She saw me near the table. I convinced her she had imagined it, that her word would ruin her reputation. She believed me, poor child. Fear is the best accomplice. Clara's name upon his lips made Marple's eyes narrow with sorrow. You used her kindness. That will weigh heavier than the rope, Mr. Hensley, the breaking point. For a moment, Victor's bravado faltered. He pressed his shackled hands to his face, his voice muffled. Do you think I wanted this? That I dreamed of ending her life? I wanted respect, security, to stand as more than a shadow. But she forced me into the role of a villain. Bentley's voice was iron. You chose the role. You wrote it with poison. Victor's shoulders shook. Whether from sobs or rage, it was unclear. Miss Marple spoke gently, her words quiet yet unyielding. No one forced your hand. Margaret's choice was hers. Yours was murder. Do not pretend fate guided you. It was greed. Victor lowered his hands. His eyes were red, hollow. For the first time, he looked older, smaller, utterly defeated. The final confession. He whispered, I dreamed of hearing the clock chime at midnight, knowing I had won. Instead, I hear it still, every tick-tock mocking me. That crash of glass, her eyes as they dimmed. They follow me. They will follow me to the gallows. The room was silent save for the distant drip of water through stone. Inspector Bentley leaned back, his voice curt. That's enough. You've confessed the method, the motive, the moment. It will hang you clean. Victor gave a hollow laugh. Clean? Nothing about this is clean. Not the orchids, not the glass, not my hands. They'll never be clean again. Miss Marple rose slowly, gathering her knitting bag. Her gaze lingered upon him one last time. You sought to control her legacy, Mr. Hensley, but your own legacy will be this. A cautionary tale of ambition turned to rot. Lady Margaret will be remembered for her orchids. You, only for your crime. Aftermath. The constables entered, unlocking the door with a heavy clang. Victor Hensley did not resist as they hauled him to his feet. His confession had drained him utterly, leaving behind only a husk of the man he once pretended to be. As he shuffled down the corridor, the echo of his chains was almost rhythmic, like the ticking of the clock he so despised. When the door clanged shut behind him, silence fell. Bentley exhaled, running a hand down his mustache. By heaven, Miss Marple, I thought I'd seen every kind of criminal, but he wore his crime like a cloak, woven tight until you tore the seams. Marple gave a faint smile, though her eyes were weary. Truth is stubborn, Inspector. It hides in corners, but it cannot be banished. Last night we saw the mask slip. Tonight, we heard the soul behind it. That is the full confession. She gathered her shawl, her figure small yet steady in the dim lantern light. And now Margaret may rest. Chapter 9. Epilogue. The last secret of the conservatory. The storm had passed. The night of the reenactment, the arrest, the shouts, the broken masks, it was all over. The next morning, Netherfield was quiet, wrapped not in tension, but in the uneasy calm that follows a storm. Miss Marple moved slowly through the great house, her steps soft upon the polished floors. The Fairfax family had retreated to their chambers, shaken but relieved, their faces pale and hollow. Even Inspector Bentley had departed, promising to return for the final paperwork. Only the servants' footsteps echoed faintly, tentative, as though they feared waking the shadows still clinging to the halls. Drawn by instinct, Miss Marple entered Lady Margaret's private study. The air smelled faintly of ink and dried flowers, the remnants of a life that had once revolved around order, beauty, and control. She sat at the desk, her fingers brushing over neat stacks of papers until they found a small leather-bound journal tucked beneath a folder. Opening it, she saw Margaret's handwriting, firm, graceful, unshaken until the very end. She flipped to the last page. There, in ink darker than the rest, were words that pierced her like a whisper from the grave. Betrayal never comes from the door outside, but from the very table we trust. Miss Marple closed her eyes for a moment. Margaret had known. Perhaps not the name, but the shape of treachery. She had sensed that her death, when it came, would not come from strangers or intruders, but from those seated closest to her, bound by family and trust. Placing the journal back with quiet reverence, Miss Marple rose and crossed into the conservatory. Morning light streamed down, painting the orchids with gold. The glass ceiling no longer seemed like a prison of secrets, but a mirror of truth. Here, under the brightness of day, the murder felt almost impossible, absurd. How could such darkness have thrived in a room so open, so filled with light? And yet, Miss Marple thought, that was the irony. Evil does not always lurk in shadows. Sometimes it hides in plain sight, among familiar smiles and trusted voices. The family gathered later that afternoon, subdued, each carrying their own burden of guilt and shame. Julian stood stiff, still angry, but now with himself. Clara avoided every gaze, her eyes swollen from tears. Dr. Green busied himself with silence. Emily wrung her hands, whispering prayers. They were not killers, but they had all lied, concealed, or betrayed in small ways. The crime had exposed not just one murderer, but the frailty of them all. Miss Marple, in her calm, unassuming way, offered no scolding. She simply said, "Lady Margaret wished her orchids to thrive long after her. Perhaps you should let them remind you that truth, like light, always finds its way through the glass." There was no reply, but in the silence something shifted. A faint recognition, perhaps even resolve. Later, as Miss Marple left Netherfield, the sun was setting, its rays spilling through the conservatory dome. The orchids glowed in hues of white and crimson, silent witnesses to both betrayal and justice. She paused at the gate, her eyes drifting back one last time. A faint smile touched her lips. "In a room made entirely of light," she murmured, "nothing can remain hidden forever." And with that, she turned away, her small figure fading down the country lane, leaving Netherfield and its ghosts behind. Teaser. A whisper of the next mystery. That night, back in her quiet cottage at St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple sat by the fire, the soft click of her knitting needles filling the silence. Yet her mind did not rest. On the small wooden table lay a new envelope, slipped beneath her door without a sound. The paper was damp from the evening mist, the handwriting hurried, almost frantic. She opened it, and her eyes narrowed as she read the single line inside. "Come to Hawthorne Hall before another death is claimed by midnight." The fire crackled, shadows deepened, and Miss Marple leaned back, her face grave. The night's peace had already been broken. Another mystery was waiting.